To think about Hinduism, which I admit I'm not an expert on, but I've read a lot and have deep respect for it, is to have a different idea about time and infinity. And in Hinduism, there's an idea that the ages of the earth and time and the universe are infinite, looking backwards and forwards, so there is no beginning and there is no end. And there's a saying that if you had a bird that touched a wing on the top of the Himalayas once every 1,000 years and kept doing that for time and time until the Himalayas were finally eroded away, that would just be one eon. When I teach Hinduism, I often begin by saying that if we, Unitarian Universalists, were to fully live into our faith, we would have a lot in common with this oldest world religion. Hinduism recognizes, as Unitarian Universalists also acknowledge, that other faiths are different paths up the same mountain of life. In Hinduism, Christianity, for example, is recognized as a form of bhakti yoga, a path that finds enlightenment through emotion and a belief that love is at the base of every heart. This vision of God or Brahman or infinite love allows for a connection, too, with that sense of the infinite, including adoration and worship of the many possible images of God within Hinduism, which are all designed to connect the human soul to the infinite. As Unitarian Universalists, we often profess to see the unity of all as well, which includes the many religious paths. We are one of the few religious traditions that explicitly says in our sources, which are always printed on the backs of your orders of service, that we draw from the wisdom from the world's religions, which inspire us in our ethical and spiritual lives. And we also profess a universal love for all, which is not about belief, but the mystic idea that there is a spark of the divine or the sacred within every person that can connect to that divine or sacred without. In Christianity, a loving soul to a loving God. The problem is that we are still products of our Western mindset, which, by the way, is okay. It is. What can we do? This is who we are. But our Western world has a limited vision of the infinite compared to Hinduism. As religion scholar Houston Smith says, Westerners are scientists. We quantify and measure things. There is a beginning and a middle and an end to things. Infinity is thought of mathematically, perhaps a long string of numbers. It is not an infinity of the soul, as it is in Hinduism, nor an infinity of time and space, with no beginning nor end, which is incomprehensible to our limited human minds. This kind of infinity, this kind of understanding, is considered higher knowledge in Hinduism, a religion which is all about psychology, Smith says, the psychology of the soul, with an understanding that the soul infinitely holds everything, all that is and ever was or will be. And this kind of everything soul is also within everything else, so that our souls resound with the souls of geese, mountains, and waters. As you hold this idea, or try to hold this idea, you might also imagine that Hinduism also has a different ecology. For all things and beings on earth, in fact, all the universe, all things are possessed of the same infinite quality, containing all that is, that ever was, or that ever will be. Our souls in Hinduism have the capacity to grasp this infinity in everything we see or sense, if we would only wake up to our true natures. In Western thought, most holy places are holy because of a human or a saint who once did something there. In Hinduism, many places are sacred in their own right, as Kenny mentioned, usually without the need of any human interaction. This permeating sense of the holy in all things reminds Houston Smith and many Westerners of the ecological understanding of many indigenous peoples, who also see the sacred possessed in every mountain, river, and rock, as well as in every animal, insect, and bird, with each being, animate and inanimate, representing or containing echoes of the very first fox, the very first mountain, the very first human. Imagine that. Everything. Everything. As my friend Peter Sawtell, a United Church of Christ minister and director of Eco Justice Ministries in Denver, is always bemoaning, the Christian and Jewish mindset, our Western worldview, see a distant God that created the earth at the beginning of time, and humans were instructed to name everything and be stewards. But they are set apart, usually seen as over other creatures, as having dominion over the earth, as it says in Genesis. In Jewish tradition, we humans are supposed to be like gods or angels, which is a little closer to Hinduism, but the earth itself in our Western mind is a material thing to be dissected and studied. It is not filled with a sacred infinity. It is not a holder of God or creative spirit. And in fact, Christians especially have condemned other religions for their pagan notions, accusing others of worshiping false idols and false gods, with absolutely no understanding of this other worldview, which sees the infinite within everything. Here's how the American Institute of Vedic Studies describes Hindu ecology. This sense of the divine in all of nature is the reason why Hindus find sacred places everywhere. The Hindus have sacred mountains and hills, sacred rivers and lakes, sacred trees and grasses, sacred flowers. They can honor the divine not only in the human form, but in all the forms of nature. This Hindu devotional attitude is not mere primitive idolatry, as the Western religions would like to project. It is not a worship of nature externally, like worshiping a tree or something like that. It is a recognition of the divine reality within all things. Hindus also recognize the formless divine, even beyond a creator, extending to the absolute. Vedanta teaches us that this absolute, or Brahman, which is the biggest name they can come up with whatever that is the being, self, and soul of everything animate and inanimate. It says our very self, which is capitalized with an S, is the entire universe. Our very self is the entire universe, and the entire universe dwells within us. To honor nature is to honor ourselves. To honor ourselves, one should honor all of nature. Now imagine that some of you resonate with that perspective, but it is very difficult for a Western mind to truly believe it. We are scientists, by and large, and we do believe that we live in a world where we can solve almost anything, perhaps even control anything. And do you truly see the infinite in every person you meet? I think sometimes we have trouble with inherent worth and dignity. Now we're talking about seeing the infinite within every single person here. And do you know that your soul is infinite and contains everything? You, yourself. How hard this is for some of us who may be filled with guilt from our very earliest ages for our very many flaws and sins. If it gives you any comfort, in Hinduism, most souls don't get this either until after many, many, many years of being reborn over and over again until their soul finally emerges and becomes enlightened. The primal understanding that all of nature is sacred, if revived and understood from this very different worldview, would make addressing climate change, pollution, water shortages, the extinctions of species, a sacred and holy exercise and responsibility, not a mechanical, purely scientific question, which often especially weighs the values of each species against a human measuring stick. Now, my message this morning is not to convert you to Hinduism or the faith of the Navajo. I want you, though, to be able to imagine stepping outside your Western mindset to imagine another worldview, even though it may be fading, not only here, but even in India. If we were to understand Hinduism a bit, we would move from our concept of the Western world, to the more inclusive and larger Hindu universe, Smith says, and I believe we would be living into and creating a more inclusive dimension of our Unitarian Universalist faith. We would actually understand in a larger sense the unity of all and universal love for all within our very souls. And we would be able to build a new ecology. An indication of how far we have to go, to my way of thinking, is our continued putting down of our own Western roots, the Christianity, bhakti path of love from which we sprung. The chip on our collective shoulders remains heavy. Many of us have trouble even seeing the beauty of Jesus' life and example, which our Unitarian and Universalist forebears thought was the essence of Christianity. The incredible love for all that Jesus taught, no matter what religion or station in life. As Hindu Mahatma Gandhi once put it, if all Christians acted like Christ, the whole world would be Christian. Jesus, like Buddha and Lao Tzu, are old souls within the cosmic view of Hinduism. They sprung up at another beginning in the midst of all that is. If we could get to know our souls, we too would be connected to the infinite and to that which is truly real. No longer connected to those finite ideas of ourselves and a limited view of time and space. Now, my limited imagination of this infinity is often directed to what I see that is obviously, to me, beautiful. But this infinity includes everything, absolutely everything. It includes death and sorrow and grief as also being sacred in Hinduism. For everything infinite is also mysterious and unknowable, and calls each of us to participate in the peace that passeth all understanding, which includes weeping with those who mourn. Smith writes, to reject the shadow side of life, to pass it by with averted eyes, refusing our share of common sorrow, while expecting our share of common joy, would cause the unlived, rejected shadows within us to deepen as fear of death. He then tells a story of a recent Zen master who liked to stroll in the evenings through a nearby village. One evening, he heard wailing in a house, and he stopped and went in very quietly, and he learned that the householder had died and his family and neighbors were crying. Immediately, this master sat down and began to cry as well. An elderly gentleman, shaken by this display of emotion from a famous master, remarked, "I would have thought that you at least were beyond such things. But it is this which puts me beyond it," the master replied through his sobs. It is easier to understand the master's empathy toward others, Smith says, but the idea that his participation in sorrow is what puts him beyond into the infinite is harder to comprehend. He is delving into the mystery of the peace that passeth all understanding, which comes when the pain of life is not relieved, for it is part of all that is real and infinite. This understanding shimmers on the crest of a wave of pain, Smith says, and transforms frustration into a shaft of light. It is the spiritual understanding of Hinduism's belief that all in the world is as it should be. There is nothing in infinity that we should or could change. When I read this to Michael this morning, my lovely accountant husband, his mind was going like this. It's just so different than the way we think. We are Westerners, and we are all about change, trying to make things better and better. I know that this is hard to hear or understand, and maybe you don't even want to, which is okay. It reminds me, though, of what I learned in seminary about a God or a spirit that is a verb instead of a noun, a movement, not an anthropomorphic being, and that this spirit or love or great peace is with us and cries with us when we cry. A deeper understanding of infinity, however you might name it beyond mathematics, also would teach us to embrace the sorrow and injustice in our world, and to be there with those who mourn and suffer, as is conceived of in Jesus' great Beatitudes. So on this beautiful morning, with the skies full of calling geese, I hope your soul might be touched with the infinite beauty of all that is, that ever was, or that will be. And I wish for our souls that deepest compassion and peace that would keep us from being so fearful and would bring us to cry with all those who grieve. Amen. This church, this congregation and community is